Hey guys, tonight we're going to be talking about something a little heavy. Something that probably won't make you want to go raid the fridge afterward. We're going to be talking about the absolutely horrifying reign of the Ottoman Sultans. Now, you might think of the Ottoman Empire as a place of grand palaces, beautiful mosaics, and powerful armies, and it was all of those things. But beneath that glittering facade lay a dark and brutal reality. A world of unimaginable cruelty and cold. Calculated violence. This wasn't just a political system, it was a psychological one, built on a foundation of terror and a horrifying, unique system of succession that almost certainly would have gotten you killed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere far away, or maybe just down the street, tell us your location and what time it is for you right now. It's always wild to me how we're all listening to this at the same time. From all over the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a young boy in the Ottoman Empire, and you've been born into the most powerful family in the world. You're a prince, a son of the Sultan, a man who rules an empire that stretches across 3 continents. You live in a palace, a world of unimaginable luxury and wealth. You have the best teachers, the finest clothes, and a future that seems to be filled with endless possibility. But you also know, deep down, that you are a dead man walking. Your birthright is not just a promise of power, it is a death sentence. The Ottoman Empire was, in its early days, a place of constant, brutal civil war. Whenever a sultan died, all of his sons would fight for the throne, a bloody, chaotic struggle that would tear the empire apart. This was not a good way to run an empire. It was a terrible way to run an empire. So a new system was devised, a new law that was so cruel, so utterly without mercy, that it's hard to even comprehend. It was a law that was meant to bring stability, but it did so at the cost of 1,000 lives. It was called the Law of Fratricide. The Law of Fratricide was a simple, brutal rule when a new sultan came to power. He had the right, some would say, the duty to murder all of his brothers. This wasn't a choice, it was a political necessity. The sultan's mother, a powerful and ruthless woman, would often be the one to give the order. The brothers would be led to a room, and they would be strangled with a silk cord. A silk cord, because the blood of a prince was considered too holy to be spilled. It was a gruesome, ironic formality. This is a common historical fact. The law of fratricide was a brutal but effective way of preventing civil war and securing the power of the sultan. But it was also a horrifying tradition that resulted in the murder of dozens of innocent princes. Imagine you're a prince, and you've just heard the news that your father, the sultan, has died. Your first thought is not of grief, it is of a cold, terrifying dread. You know that your brother, who you may have played with, may have loved, is now going to come for you. You know that he is going to have you strangled with a silk cord. Your entire life, which was so full of promise, is now just a matter of hours, of minutes. You're not a person anymore, you're a threat. You're a political problem that needs to be solved. And the solution is death. A little known but fascinating detail from this time is how the princes would be prepared for this. They would be taught to be quiet, to be obedient, to not make a fuss. They would be taught that their death was a necessity, a sacrifice for the good of the empire. They would be taught that their lives were not their own, that they were a part of a larger, more important story. It was a kind of psychological conditioning, a way of preparing them for their own brutal, horrifying end. The fratricide law is a point that historians still debate. To what extent was this a necessary evil that brought a long period of stability to the Ottoman Empire? Or was it a barbaric and unnecessary act of cruelty that stained the empire forever? Some argue that without this law, the empire would have torn itself apart in a series of bloody civil wars. a fate that befell many other empires. Others argue that it was a symptom of a deeper, more brutal problem, a system that valued power over humanity. The debate highlights the complex interplay of politics, power, and morality. The death of the princes was not a public spectacle. It was a quiet, private affair that happened in the dead of night. Behind the high walls of the Topkapi Palace, the bodies would then be buried in a private cemetery, and the world would go on, as if nothing had happened. It was a kind of collective amnesia, a way of pretending that the brutal, horrifying reality of the empire was not real. But it was real, and you, a prince, a dead man walking, would know it in your bones. The whispers, the hushed conversations, the cold, terrifying dread that was always present in the air of the palace would be your only companions. The constant, gnawing fear of your own death would be the only thing you could ever truly call your own. And as you lie in your bed, in your luxurious room, you can hear the sounds of the palace, the faint whispers, the shuffling of feet, and, with a cold certainty that any of those footsteps could be the ones that are coming for you. And in that, there is a kind of strange comfort, a sense of shared humanity that connects you to all of the other princes, all of the other dead men walking across the centuries. In the quiet, still of the night, you're a young Ottoman prince, and the cold, terrifying reality of the law of fratricide is a constant, gnawing presence in your life. You've just survived the death of your father, the Sultan, and the subsequent murder of your brothers. You're alive, but you're not free. You are now the sole heir to the throne, and you have to be protected from yourself, from your own ambition, from the possibility that you might try to seize power before your time. So, a new system was devised, a new kind of prison that was both a place of unimaginable luxury and a place of utter, soul-crushing despair. It was called the cafes, or the cage. The cafes was a part of the Topkapi Palace, a series of lavishly decorated rooms that were, in effect, a gilded cage. Here, the Sultan's brothers and other potential heirs were kept in isolation, often for decades at a time. They had servants, concubines, and all the luxuries money could buy. But they were prisoners. They were not allowed to leave the palace. They were not allowed to have children, and they were kept in a state of constant, terrifying uncertainty. They were, in effect, put on a shelf, a kind of political spare part that could be taken out and used if the Sultan died without an heir. This is a common historical fact. The cafes was a brutal but effective way of preventing princes from building up a power base and challenging the Sultan. But it was also a system that created a generation of mentally unstable, and often deeply damaged, rulers. Imagine you're a prince, and you've been in the cafes for 20 years. You were a young boy when you were put in there, and now you're a middle-aged man. You've never seen the outside world. You've never ridden a horse or fought in a battle or led an army. Your entire world is a few rooms, a few courtyards, and a few dozen servants who are, for all intents and purposes, your jailers. You're living a life of utter, soul-crushing boredom. Your days are spent in a haze of idleness, and your nights are filled with a terrifying dread, the fear that at any moment, a team of executioners could come to your door and strangle you with a silk cord. The constant, gnawing fear of your own death, which was once a part of your life, is now the only thing you have to look forward to. A little known but fascinating detail from this time is how the princes in the cafes would try to pass the time. Some would become poets, or artists, or scholars. They would try to find a small measure of meaning in their meaningless lives. Others would just go mad. They would talk to themselves, or to the birds in the courtyard, or to the ghosts that they believed haunted the palace. The isolation, the constant fear, and the lack of purpose would slowly but surely drive them insane. The Ottoman Empire was, in a sense, a kingdom of madmen, a place where the rulers were often men who had spent their entire lives in a gilded prison. The cafes is a point that historians still debate. To what extent did this system of succession create a series of weak and ineffectual rulers that ultimately led to the decline of the Ottoman Empire? Some argue that by taking the most promising princes and locking them up, the empire was ensuring that its rulers would be men who were completely unprepared for the immense challenges of a vast, sprawling empire. Others argued that the system was simply a product of its time, a necessary evil that, for a while, brought a degree of stability to a chaotic world. The debate highlights the complex interplay of power, politics, and the human psyche, a slightly humorous, if dark, detail from this time is how the princes would try to get information about the outside world. They would bribe their servants, or they would try to listen to the whispers in the walls. They were like a group of men in a secret society, and their only goal was to find out what was happening in the world that they were so cruelly denied. For a brief moment, you can almost see them as a group of desperate, lonely men, trying to find a small measure of connection in a world that had completely forgotten them. And as you lie in your bed, in your luxurious room, you can hear the sounds of the palace, the faint whispers, the shuffling of feet, and you know, with a cold certainty, that your entire life is a waiting game. You are waiting for the Sultan to die. You are waiting for the executioners to come. You are waiting for a life that you will never truly have. And in that, there's a kind of strange comfort, a sense of shared humanity that connects you to all of the other princes, all of the other dead men walking across the centuries in the quiet. Still of the night, the palace is a gilded cage, and the Sultan's brothers are ghosts in waiting. But the horrifying reach of the Ottoman Empire's power doesn't stop at the palace walls. It extends out into the empire's farthest corners, to the Christian villages and towns that were a crucial part of its vast territory. Here, a different kind of horror was being enacted, a cold, calculated form of conscription that was both brutal and brilliant. It was called the devshirme, or the blood tax. The devshirme was a system where Ottoman officials, usually every few years, would go to Christian villages and forcibly conscript a number of young boys. The boys would be taken from their homes, from their families, and from their culture. They would be converted to Islam, and they would be raised to be loyal servants of the Sultan. This wasn't a punishment, it was a policy. It was a way of creating a new, loyal elite, a force of men who had no family ties, no religious loyalties, and no political ambitions other than to serve the Sultan. Imagine you're a young boy in a Christian village in the Balkans. You're playing in the fields, or you're helping your father with his work. And then you see them, the Ottoman officials, in their magnificent uniforms, riding on their horses. You know what they're here for. Your parents, who have been telling you stories about this your whole life, are terrified. They are trying to hide you, but it's no use. You are a strong, healthy boy, and they want you. They take you away, and you never see your family again. You are given a new name, a new religion, and a new life. Your old life, your old family, your old self is gone forever. This is a common historical fact. The devshirme was a brutal but effective system of conscription that provided the Ottoman Empire with a powerful and loyal army. But it was also a horrifying form of social engineering that tore families apart and destroyed cultures. A little known but fascinating detail from this time is how the Christian parents would try to make their sons less appealing to the Ottoman officials. They would sometimes try to maim their children, or they would try to teach them bad habits, or they would try to make them look sick and weak. It was a desperate, heartbreaking attempt to keep their children. A futile gesture of defiance against an empire that was too powerful to defy. The irony is that the Ottoman officials were looking for the best and the brightest, the strongest and the healthiest. They wanted the best boys, and they got them. The devshirme is a point that historians still debate. Was this a system of slavery, or was it a form of forced conscription that, for some, provided a path to power and wealth? Some of the boys who were conscripted through the devshirme would go on to become powerful generals, governors, and even grand viziers. They would rise to the highest levels of the Ottoman government, a path that would have been impossible for them in their home villages. Others argue that this was simply a way of justifying a horrifying form of human trafficking, a system that was built on the pain and suffering of thousands of families. The debate highlights the complex and contradictory nature of a system that was both a brutal form of oppression and a rare, but real, path to social mobility, a slightly humorous, if dark. Detail from this time is how the janissaries, the elite soldiers who were a product of the devshirme, would sometimes go back to their home villages to visit their families. Imagine being a parent, and you see your son, a man you haven't seen in 20 years, a man in a magnificent uniform, a man who has become a powerful and feared soldier. He comes back to your village and he's a stranger. He doesn't speak your language, he doesn't share your religion, and he doesn't know you anymore. It's a heartbreaking, tragic reunion, a kind of ghost returning to a life that is no longer his. And as you lay in your bed, in your village, you can hear the sounds of the night, and you can't help but wonder if tomorrow will be the day that the officials come. You are not a person anymore, you're a statistic, a number on a ledger, a resource that an empire needs. And in that, there's a kind of strange comfort, a sense of shared humanity that connects you to all of the other parents, all of the other children, across the centuries, in the quiet, still of the night. The devshirme has taken you from your home, from your family, and from your culture. You're a young boy, a raw recruit in a new world, and your old life is gone forever. You've been given a new name, a new religion, and a new purpose to serve the Sultan with an unyielding loyalty. You are not a person anymore. You are a weapon, a living instrument of the Sultan's will. You are a janissary. The janissaries were the elite infantry units of the Ottoman army, a force of men who were feared and respected throughout the known world. They were the product of the devshirme, a force of Christian boys who were raised in a way that would make them the most loyal and ruthless soldiers imaginable. They were not allowed to marry or have children in the early days, and their only family was the Sultan himself. They lived in barracks, trained relentlessly, and their loyalty was absolute. This is a common historical fact. The janissaries were a powerful and disciplined force that was a key factor in the expansion and success of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Imagine you're a janissary, a grown man who has spent his entire life in the barracks, a man who has never known a family other than his fellow soldiers. You've been taught to fight, to kill, and to die for the Sultan without question. Your loyalty is not a choice. It is a fundamental part of who you are. You wear a distinctive uniform, a magnificent helmet with a spoon holder on the front, a symbol of your status as a warrior who eats from the Sultan's table. You are a part of a brotherhood, a family of men who have all been taken from their homes and raised for a single purpose: to serve. A little known but fascinating detail from this time is how the janissaries would express their dissent. They were not allowed to speak out against the Sultan or to protest his policies, but they had a powerful and unique way of showing their displeasure. They would overturn their cauldrons. The cauldron, which was used to cook their food, was a symbol of their loyalty and their bond to the Sultan. When they overturned their cauldrons, it was a sign that they were no longer loyal, that they were no longer willing to serve. It was a silent but terrifying sign of rebellion, and it was a sign that the Sultan could not ignore. The overturned cauldron was a clear message: we are hungry and we are angry. The janissaries are a point that historians still debate. Were they the single most important factor in the success of the Ottoman Empire? Or were they a force that eventually became a corrupt and destabilizing influence that led to the empire's decline in the later years of the empire? The Janissaries became a powerful and corrupt political force. They would overthrow sultans. They would demand privileges. And they would become a kind of state within a state. The very force that was created to protect the sultan became the force that was most likely to kill him. The debate highlights the complex and contradictory nature of a system that was both a source of immense power and a source of immense danger. A slightly humorous, if dark. Detail from this time is how the Janissaries would try to get their way. They would often resort to a kind of theatrical, over-the-top display of protest. They would march through the streets of Constantinople, shouting and demanding their due. They were a force of nature, a kind of living, breathing mob that could not be stopped. For a brief moment, they were more powerful than the Sultan himself, and they knew it. And as you stand in your barracks, a Janissary, a man who has been trained to be loyal and ruthless, you can feel the conflict within you. You have been taught to obey, but you have also been taught to be a part of a powerful, proud brotherhood. You are a weapon, but you are also a man, and the two are in constant, terrifying conflict. And in that, there is a kind of strange comfort, a sense of shared humanity that connects you to all of the other Janissaries, all of the other weapons across the centuries. In the quiet, still of the night, the Janissaries are a force of terror and loyalty, a living weapon forged from the Devshirme. But as you, a devoted Janissary, stand in your barracks, a different kind of power is being wielded in a different part of the palace. It's a world of whispers and intrigue, of beautiful women and brutal politics. It is the imperial harem, and it is a place where a single woman, a mother, a concubine, could hold more power than any general or grand vizier. The harem was not just a place where the sultan kept his concubines. It was the heart of the palace, a place of immense power and political intrigue. It was a world that was completely separate from the outside world, a place of opulence and beauty, but also a place of utter cruelty and ruthless ambition. The women of the harem were, for the most part, not Turkish. They were captured slaves from all over the world, from Russia to Africa, and they were chosen for their beauty and their intelligence. They were given a new name, a new religion, and a new life, and their only purpose was to bear a son for the sultan. This is a common historical fact. The imperial harem was a place of immense power and political intrigue, a place where a woman could rise from a slave to the most powerful person in the empire. Imagine you're a concubine, a young woman who has been taken from your home and thrust into this world of incredible luxury and terrifying danger. You're a woman without a country, without a family, and without a future. Your only hope is to bear a son for the sultan. If you do, you become an Iqbal, a privileged favorite, and your son becomes a prince, a potential sultan. If you don't, you're just a woman, a beautiful decoration in a golden cage, and you will eventually be cast aside. The pressure is immense, the competition is ruthless. The women of the harem were not friends, they were rivals, and they would often resort to poison, or slander, or even murder to get ahead. A little known but fascinating detail from this time is how the mothers of the princes, the Valide Sultan, would become the most powerful person in the empire. The Sultan, who was often a young boy when he came to power, was often under the thumb of his mother. She would control his access to the outside world. She would choose his grand vizier, and she would, in effect, rule the empire from behind the scenes. This was a powerful but also precarious position. The Valide Sultan had to be a master of intrigue, a master of deception, and a master of murder. She had to be willing to do whatever it took to protect her son and her power from her rivals. The harem was not just a place of beautiful women, it was a place of political assassins. And the most dangerous of them all was the mother of the sultan. The harem is a point that historians still debate to what extent did the harem, a world of ruthless female power, contribute to the decline of the Ottoman Empire? Or was it a place that, for a time, brought a measure of stability to a chaotic world? Some argue that the harem, with its constant intrigues and its focus on power and wealth, was a major source of corruption and a destabilizing influence on the empire. Others argue that the women of the harem, with their political acumen and their ruthless ambition, were often a stabilizing force, a way of keeping the malevolent and often insane sultans in check. The debate highlights the complex and contradictory nature of a system that was both a source of power and a source of immense danger, a slightly humorous, if dark, detail from this time is how the women of the harem would try to get the sultan's attention. They would learn to play an instrument, or they would learn to dance, or they would learn to tell a good story. They were a kind of living, breathing art form, and their only goal was to be noticed. For a brief moment, you can almost see them as a group of desperate, lonely women, trying to find a small measure of connection in a world that had completely forgotten them. And as you stand in your barracks, a janissary, a man who has been trained to be loyal and ruthless, you can't help but wonder about the world inside the palace, the world of the harem, a world that is so different from your own, but a world that, in its own way, is just as brutal and just as dangerous. And in that, there is a kind of strange comfort, a sense of shared humanity that connects you to all of the other men and women, all of the other weapons, across the centuries, in the quiet, still of the night. The harem is a world of whispers and intrigue, a beautiful but deadly cage where power is everything. But as you, a concubine, navigate this treacherous world, a different kind of power is on display for the entire empire to see. It's the sultan's public spectacle, a horrifying form of social control that kept the population in a state of constant fear. The sultan, a man who rarely left his palace, was a master of using public punishments and executions as a way of projecting his absolute, unchallengeable power. The streets of Constantinople, a bustling, chaotic, and magnificent city, were also a stage for the sultan's grim theater. A man who was a criminal, or a man who was a political rival, could be executed in public, in a square, or in a park. The executioner, a silent, terrifying figure, would carry out the sentence with a brutal efficiency. The body would then be left on display, a grim, terrifying warning to anyone who dared to challenge the sultan's authority. The message was clear: I am the law and my power is absolute. This is a common historical fact. Public executions were a horrifying but effective form of social control that kept the population in a state of constant fear and obedience. Imagine you're a merchant, and you're walking through the streets of Constantinople. The city is a vibrant, chaotic place, a city of 1,000 smells and 1,000 sounds. But then you see it, a man hanging from a gallows, his body swaying in the wind. You don't know who he is, or what he did, but you know, with a cold certainty, that he challenged the sultan, and that he paid the ultimate price. You see the crowd, a silent, terrified mob, looking at the body with a mixture of fear and awe. You know that you, a simple merchant, a man who is just trying to get by, are nothing in the face of this power. You are just a subject, a cog in a massive, terrifying machine. A little known but fascinating detail from this time is the role of the Bostan Shibasha, the chief gardener of the palace. This was not a humble job. The Bostan Shibasha was, in effect, the sultan's executioner, and he was often the one who carried out the executions. He was a powerful and feared man, a man who had the power of life and death. and his word was law. It was a terrifying, ironic title. A man who was in charge of beautiful gardens and also in charge of a brutal, horrifying, and very public form of death. The Sultan's public spectacle is a point that historians still debate. To what extent did this brutal form of social control create a stable and long-lasting empire? Or did it create a culture of fear and resentment that ultimately led to the empire's decline? Some argue that the Sultan's brutal public displays of power were a necessary evil, a way of keeping a vast and diverse empire from falling into chaos. Others argue that it was a symptom of a deeper, more brutal problem, a system that was built on fear and terror, and that this fear would eventually lead to a decline in loyalty and a rise in resentment. The debate highlights the complex and contradictory nature of a system that was both a source of power and a source of immense danger. A slightly humorous, if dark, detail from this time is how the Sultan would sometimes send a message to his Grand Vizier. The message would be a small, unassuming gift, a silk purse with a few coins in it. But the Grand Vizier would know, with a cold certainty, that the coins were not a gift. They were a bribe. A bribe to tell the Sultan that he was a bad Grand Vizier. The message was a kind of theatrical, over-the-top display of power, a way of saying, I am the Sultan, and I can have you killed at any moment, and as you stand in the streets of Constantinople. A merchant. A man who is just trying to get by. You can't help but feel a sense of unease. The city is beautiful, but it is also a stage for a terrible, terrifying, and very public form of death. You are not a person anymore, you're a subject, a cog in a massive, terrifying machine. And in that, there is a kind of strange comfort, a sense of shared humanity that connects you to all of the other merchants, all of the other subjects across the centuries in the quiet, still of the night. The public spectacle of a brutal execution is a chilling reminder of the Sultan's absolute power. But within the palace walls, a different kind of power is being wielded, a power that is immense but also incredibly precarious. It's the power of the Grand Vizier, a man who is second only to the Sultan himself, a man who has all the power in the world, but a man who is also a whisper away from death. The Grand Vizier was the Sultan's chief minister, his right-hand man, and the de facto ruler of the empire. He was a man of immense power and wealth, a man who commanded armies, controlled the treasury, and presided over the imperial council. He was, in effect, the person who ran the day-to-day affairs of a vast and sprawling empire. But his power was not his own. It was a gift from the Sultan, and it could be taken away at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all. This is a common historical fact. The Grand Vizier served at the pleasure of the Sultan, and his tenure could be incredibly short and incredibly brutal. Imagine you're a Grand Vizier, a man who has risen from nothing to the pinnacle of power. You've outsmarted your rivals, you've won battles, and you've gained the Sultan's trust. You live in a magnificent palace. You have a vast retinue of servants, and your word is law. But you also know, deep down, that you are a dead man walking. You are constantly on edge, constantly looking over your shoulder, constantly afraid that a misstep, a wrong word, or a simple change in the Sultan's mood could be the end of you. Your power, which is so absolute, is also incredibly fragile. A little known but fascinating detail from this time is how the Sultan would signal his displeasure with the Grand Vizier. He would not scream or shout. He would not send a letter. He would send a simple gift, a bowl of sherbet. If the sherbet was white, it meant that the Sultan was pleased and the Grand Vizier's life was safe. But if the sherbet was red, it meant that the Sultan was displeased and that the Grand Vizier had a few hours to live. The message was clear, brutal, and utterly without mercy. The Grand Vizier would then have to spend his final hours in a state of quiet, terrifying dread. A man who was once the most powerful person in the empire, now just a man who was about to die. The precarious position of the Grand Vizier is a point that historians still debate. To what extent did the Sultan's brutal and unpredictable use of power prevent the rise of a corrupt and powerful bureaucracy? Or did it create a culture of fear and sycophancy that ultimately led to the empire's decline? Some argue that the Sultan's brutal use of power was a necessary evil, a way of keeping the Grand Viziers and the rest of the bureaucracy from becoming too powerful and too corrupt. Others argue that it was a system that rewarded sycophancy and punished honesty, and that this led to a long-term decline in the quality of the Ottoman leadership. The debate highlights the complex and contradictory nature of a system that was both a source of immense power and a source of immense danger, a slightly humorous, if dark. Detail from this time is how a Grand Vizier would prepare for his death. He would often write a letter to the Sultan, begging for mercy, or he would try to bribe the executioner. But the executioner, a man who was also a product of the Sultan's terrifying power, would be unmoved. The Grand Vizier, a man who had once been a master of all things, would be reduced to a beggar, a man who was pleading for his life. It was a kind of karmic justice, a horrifying but strangely satisfying end to a life of immense power and immense danger. And as you lie in your bed, in your magnificent palace, a Grand Vizier, a man who has everything, you can't help but feel a sense of unease. You are not a person anymore. You're a symbol, a temporary stand-in for the Sultan's power, and you know, with a cold certainty, that any of the servants in your palace could be the one to bring you a bowl of sherbet. And in that, there is a kind of strange comfort, a sense of shared humanity that connects you to all of the other Grand Viziers, all of the other dead men walking across the centuries in the quiet, still of the night. The Grand Vizier, for all his power, is a whisper away from death, and the Sultan, for all his might, is a prisoner in his own palace. But how does a Sultan, a man who is so isolated, so cut off from the outside world, maintain his absolute control? The answer lies in a different kind of power, a power that is everywhere and nowhere all at once. It's the power of information, the power of a vast network of spies and informants that allowed the Sultan to maintain a terrifying grip on his empire and his own court. The Ottoman Empire was a vast and diverse place, and ruling it from a single palace in Constantinople was a monumental task. The Sultan, who often had little to no contact with the outside world, had to rely on a network of people who would bring him information. This network was not a formal intelligence agency in the modern sense. It was a sprawling, decentralized web of spies, informants, and informers who were everywhere. They were in the mosques, in the markets, in the coffee houses, and even in the Sultan's own harem. Their job was simple: to listen, to watch, and to report on anything that could be considered a threat to the Sultan's authority. This is a common historical fact. The Sultan's use of spies and informants was a key part of his ability to maintain absolute power over a vast and sprawling empire. Imagine you're a merchant in Constantinople, and you're in a coffee house, talking to your friends about the high taxes and the rising cost of bread. You're not being seditious, you're just complaining. But you know, with a cold certainty, that someone in that room is listening. Someone is going to go back to the palace, and they're going to report your words. You don't know who they are, and you don't know what they look like. They could be the man selling you coffee, or the woman sitting in the corner, or even your own friend. The paranoia is a constant, gnawing presence in your life. You can't trust anyone, and you can't say anything that could be construed as a threat to the Sultan's authority. The fear is so pervasive that it's almost a kind of invisible, psychological prison. A little known but fascinating detail from this time is the role of the mute executioners, a group of deaf-mute men who were a part of the Sultan's inner circle. They were the men who carried out the executions, and they were the men who would go out into the city to collect information. They were terrifying figures, men who could not speak, and who, therefore, could not be bribed or intimidated. They were a perfect symbol of the Sultan's cold, brutal, and unchallengeable power. The silence of the executioners was more terrifying than any shout, and their wordless presence was a constant, horrifying reminder of the Sultan's absolute authority. The Sultan's network of spies and informants is a point that historians still debate. To what extent did this system of fear and paranoia prevent rebellions and civil wars? Or did it create a culture of distrust and suspicion that ultimately led to the empire's decline? Some argue that the Sultan's use of spies was a necessary evil, a way of keeping a chaotic and diverse empire from falling into chaos. Others argue that it was a system that rewarded sycophancy and punished honesty, and that this led to a long-term decline in the quality of the Ottoman leadership. The debate highlights the complex and contradictory nature of a system that was both a source of immense power and a source of immense danger, a slightly humorous, if dark. Detail from this time is how the Sultan's own family was not immune to this network. The Sultan's mother, his wives, and even his own children were often spied on. The Sultan, a man who was so isolated, was also a man who was so paranoid that he could not even trust his own family. It was a kind of tragic, self-inflicted loneliness, a price that he had to pay for his absolute power. And as you lay in your bed, in your Constantinople home, a merchant, a man who was just trying to get by, you can't help but feel a sense of unease. The city is a beautiful, vibrant place, but it is also a place where a whisper can kill you. You are not a person anymore. You're a subject, a cog in a massive, terrifying machine. And in that, there's a kind of strange comfort, a sense of shared humanity that connects you to all of the other merchants, all of the other subjects, all of the other men and women who were living in a constant state of fear. Across the centuries, in the quiet, still of the night, the Grand Vizier, for all his power, is a whisper away from death, and the Sultan is a prisoner in his own palace. The empire is a vast, sprawling machine, held together by a terrifying network of spies and informants. But what happens when the very system that was designed to protect the Sultan and the empire turns on itself? What happens when the paranoia and the cruelty, the hallmarks of this brutal dynasty, start to consume the very heart of the palace? The answer lies in the psychological horror that permeated every corner of the court. A world of whispers and shadows where a single word could mean your life, and where a single glance could mean your death. The court of the Sultan was not a place of open communication and honest discourse. It was a place of intrigue, of backstabbing, and of constant, gnawing paranoia. Everyone was a potential spy, a potential rival, a potential killer. The Sultan, who was so isolated, was also a man who was so paranoid that he could not even trust his own family. He had a network of spies and informants that would report on the activities of his own mother, his own wives, and his own children. It was a kind of tragic, self-inflicted loneliness, a price that he had to pay for his absolute power. This is a common historical fact. The Sultan's court was a place of constant paranoia and intrigue, where a man could rise to the highest levels of power one day and be executed the next. Imagine you're a courtier, a man who has spent his entire life in the service of the Sultan. You're a man of immense wealth and power, but you're also a man who is living in a state of constant, gnawing fear. You're constantly watching your back, constantly weighing your words, constantly afraid that a misstep, a wrong word, or a simple change in the Sultan's mood could be the end of you. The paranoia is a constant, gnawing presence in your life. You can't trust anyone, and you can't say anything that could be construed as a threat to the Sultan's authority. The fear is so pervasive that it's almost a kind of invisible psychological prison. A little known but fascinating detail from this time is the role of the chief black eunuch, a man who was a powerful and feared figure in the palace. He was the head of the harem, and he had the power of life and death over the concubines and the servants. But he was also a man who was a trusted confidant of the Sultan, a man who had the Sultan's ear and who could influence his decisions. He was a terrifying, paradoxical figure. A man who was a slave, but a man who was also a master of his own terrifying, powerful little world. The chief black eunuch was a perfect symbol of the Ottoman court, a place where power was a complex and contradictory thing, a place where a slave could be a king and a king could be a slave. The psychological horror of the court is a point that historians still debate. To what extent did this system of fear and paranoia prevent rebellions and civil wars? Or did it create a culture of distrust and suspicion that ultimately led to the empire's decline? Some argue that the Sultan's use of spies and informants was a necessary evil, a way of keeping a chaotic and diverse empire from falling into chaos. Others argue that it was a system that rewarded sycophancy and punished honesty, and that this led to a long-term decline in the quality of the Ottoman leadership. The debate highlights the complex and contradictory nature of a system that was both a source of immense power and a source of immense danger, a slightly humorous, if dark. Detail from this time is how a courtier would try to get the Sultan's attention. He would often resort to a kind of theatrical, over-the-top display of sycophancy. He would praise the Sultan's every move. He would laugh at his jokes, and he would agree with his every opinion. It was a kind of performance, a play that everyone in the court was a part of, and the only goal was to stay alive. For a brief moment, you can almost see them as a group of desperate, lonely men, trying to find a small measure of connection in a world that had completely forgotten them. And as you lie in your bed, in your Constantinople home, a merchant, a man who is just trying to get by, you can't help but feel a sense of unease. The city is a beautiful, vibrant place, but it is also a place where a whisper can kill you. You are not a person anymore. You're a subject, a cog in a massive, terrifying machine. And in that, there is a kind of strange comfort, a sense of shared humanity that connects you to all of the other merchants, all of the other subjects, all of the other men and women who were living in a constant state of fear. Across the centuries, in the quiet, still of the night, the whispers in the palace have faded, the silk cords have been put away, and the Ottoman Empire, which once stretched across 3 continents, is now a memory, but the reign of the Ottoman Sultans, for all its horrifying cruelty and its brutal use of power, has left a dark, complicated, and unforgettable stain on history. The echoes of their absolute power, their paranoia, and their unique methods of social control still resonate today. A quiet but powerful reminder of a world that was both magnificent and terrifying. The first and most obvious echo is the sheer brutality of their methods. The fratricide law, the cafes, the devshirme, the janissaries, and the Grand Vizier's precarious position, all of these were a part of a system that was designed to maintain absolute power at any cost. This wasn't a system of checks and balances. It was a system of absolute, unchallengeable authority. And in that, we see a chillingly familiar pattern. We see it in the despots and the dictators of our own time, in the governments that rule through fear and paranoia, and in the systems that value power over humanity. The Ottoman Sultans may be gone, but their methods, their mindset, and their horrible legacy are still very much with us. Another echo is the complexity of their legacy. The Ottoman Empire, for all its flaws, was also a place of great art, great science, and great culture. It was a place that, for a time, brought a measure of stability to a chaotic world. It was a place that, for all its brutality, was also a place of immense beauty and immense innovation. The Ottoman Sultans were not just monsters. They were also patrons of the arts, builders of magnificent mosques, and rulers of a vast and diverse empire. The legacy is not a simple one. It is a complex, contradictory, and deeply human one. This brings us to a point that historians still debate: to what extent can we separate the art and the culture of the Ottoman Empire from the horrifying brutality of its rulers? Can we admire the magnificent mosques of Constantinople without also acknowledging the cruelty and the fear that built them? Can we appreciate the power of the Janissaries without also acknowledging the horrifying human cost of the Devshirme? The debate challenges us to think not just about the past, but about the art and the culture of our own time, and whether we can truly separate them from the terrible choices and the terrible actions of the men who created them. A fascinating and little-known detail from this time is how the legacy of the Ottoman Sultans was interpreted by their successors, the rulers of the Turkish Republic, which replaced the Ottoman Empire, often tried to distance themselves from the brutality and the cruelty of the sultans. They tried to create a new, modern, and secular identity. A new Turkey that was free from the dark legacy of its past. But the echoes of the sultans, the ghosts of the fratricide, the Janissaries, and the cafes, are still very much a part of the Turkish identity. A quiet, mournful whisper in the collective psyche of a people who have survived a brutal and complicated past. A slightly humorous, if dark, detail from this time is how the sultans, for all their power, were also just men. They were men who were afraid, men who were paranoid, and men who were often deeply, terribly lonely. They were men who were isolated from the world, and men who, in the end, were prisoners of their own terrifying power. The sultans, for all their magnificence, were also just a symbol, a temporary stand-in for a power that was too vast, too brutal, and too terrifying for any one man to truly wield. And as we come to the end of this journey, I want you to take a moment to reflect. The reign of the Ottoman Sultans was not a simple story of good and evil. It was a complex, contradictory, and deeply human story of power, of fear, and of survival. It was a story that, in its horrifying cruelty, also contained a kind of strange beauty and a kind of strange genius. And in that, there is a kind of strange comfort, a sense of shared humanity that connects us to them, across the centuries in the quiet, still of the night, still of